Guys, what is going on? Red here, and welcome back to this month's edition of Meta Monthly, covering both May and June 2018. Of course, May is, end of the season into the beginning of the June season, and we do have some things to cover. I mean, right now this Meta Monthly is not going to be vastly different, I would say. Um, just really the order in which the decks appear in terms of prominence might be different. But overall, the decks that appear on this month's Meta Monthly are pretty similar to what we've seen in the past. So with that being said, let's just jump right into it with, of course, deck number 3. Now, of course, starting off this month's Meta Monthly is the trap decks. Now, last month I did mention that traps were regaining prominence a little bit. Of course, people continuing to abuse the whole double dojo into some free traps and thereby double draw, which of course is, a very nice way to just overpower your opponent in resources, just build up a massive hand while reinforcing your board presence with, placing traps like Verdict, Might of the Minotaur, Aijutsu, Detonate, Camouflage, all that stuff, and again, that's not all the traps, but those are some of the more highly prominent traps that are currently being run. But you kind of get the point here. A lot of traps reinforcing one person's board, leaving the other player in a difficult spot, not wanting to activate traps, but thereby, he kind of has to hoard off an attack or make a successful push. And meanwhile, of course, the trap decks aren't alone. They are in ninjas, so of course our favorite beardy boy, the Magic Eater, is prominent in that deck, where you see him just getting a lot of stats just from placing down the free trap, not necessarily activating the traps, but he usually gets the buff when they are, played on the castle. So it makes it that much tougher for players to deal with, because you're dealing with that Magic Eater constantly growing, just as a result of placing the card down, not even activating the trap, but just placing it down. Now, in terms of variations for these trap decks, excuse me, we are seeing, of course, the standard blue-purple as being the most prominent, generally because blue is packing a lot of just stronger units. And, of course, people take Fork Lightning and Might of the Minotaur as, probably their better traps. And, of course, Ninja, no reason why you shouldn't be running it if you're not playing a trap deck. Secret Dragon, Aijutsu, and sometimes Camouflage are usually the traps you'll see. And then, of course, obviously we got the Mystic Dojo for the double draw. But another variation that's, risen slightly in prominence over the past month or so has been the Crusader variation. Now, not necessarily for their traps, but of course we all know Crusaders as being a top-tier faction. Obviously, you have the endless amount of heals that can come from the faction, but not only that, but the draw as well here. Divine Knowledge, Forbidden the City, the books, which no one really runs, and then so the draws and the heals. That's pretty much why people run Crusaders, and they usually can morph into some sort of strange knight hybrid. I've seen that once or twice, I believe, before, but really, overall, the traps are probably still in the meta. I wouldn't say they were as high as they once were. Last month I ranked them, pretty high up. I think I ranked them deck number 1 for that month's edition, but I think this time they're taking up a number 3 slot. Again, they're kind of slowing down, and with the, possible new cards on the horizon, some are theorizing that we are going to get an update as well, and obviously, alongside the various other cards that people want hit, one of those targets is, of course, Dojo. So there's a chance that this may or may not be Trap Deck's last feature on Meta Monthly, but only time will tell. But with that said, again, not a whole lot to to discover with that. I don't have an example of a trap deck either. I know people don't like that, but honestly, I don't feel like I want to play traps, so I don't keep a deck of it. Even if it's like for educational purposes. I mean, really, the only things you guys need to know that stand out in trap decks: Dojo, Magic Eater, a lot of various traps, and then a couple of other shenanigans that are based on personal preferences from players. So with that being said, enough of the trap decks. I think we should move on now into deck number 2. Our next deck to follow up the trap decks will be Crusader Pirates. Now again, the Crusader faction, and even in the next one, you'll find that the Crusader faction leaks kind of into every one of these, top tier decks, because of course, like I mentioned previously, they are just a top tier faction. So I'm kind of going to establish this now, and even you'll understand why in the next deck, how Crusaders are just top tier. But of course, like I mentioned before, draw and heals are sort of the big things you guys need to know about Crusaders. Arbiter's Return is probably one of the biggest heals out there, followed by just various different draws, Forbidden City, Divine Knowledge, etc. But with that kind of out of the way, I'm going to focus more on the deck that we have here itself, and of course the green Crusader, the Pirate Crusader, excuse me, are generally known as greed decks. Now, of course, I did mention last, Meta Month. I think they were featured in. Were they? I can't remember right now at the top of my head. But of course, this deck is no stranger to being on the Meta Monthly. It's been here pretty much for a while, and I mean for obvious reasons. One, again, similar to trap decks, these decks can just automatically grow an abundance, excuse me, of resources into their hand, just by simply nearly maybe doing even nothing, you can argue. Basically, they're relying off the School of Knowledge, which of course draws a card every time you gain an extra gold. They use that in combination with a lot of the pirate greed going around, Robins, Southport Captain, Mugging, just to name a few examples. And they just build this crazy, crazy stacked hand for just an overpowering of resources into onto the field, leaving the opponent usually to counteract with everything coming at them. But again, it's a lot of stuff coming at you, especially when you get into the late tier. That's why for these greed decks, I recommend running aggro, and it's kind of the reason why the following deck, the next deck after this one is probably the most popular because it's sort of like a direct stop to this deck. Um, but yeah, I would say greed are definitely more popular than trap decks. But they're kind of just equally as strong for, again, similar reasons. Just the overabundance of resources that can, be supplied to their hand. They do have different options than the ninjas, of course, since they are running pirates. You're going to get cards like Southport Captain, like I mentioned, Witch Doctor, Robins, like I mentioned, and of course Dwarven Scope. Probably one of the I don't want to argue it's like the best card in the game, but I think for spells, this is definitely a top tier spell. So just they have different resources than you would find in a ninja deck. But again, the premise is kind of this, like I said, the same thing as a trap deck. An overabundance, excuse me, of resources that ultimately just devastate the opponent because they can't really do anything to stop that. Unless you have what the next deck has, which is, again, the direct counter. Well, I wouldn't say direct, but they're a very good counter, and it's probably why it's the most popular deck right now. But yeah, I didn't mention more about this deck in detail, I think, last Meta Monthly, because they were, I think, either in the same spot, or, yeah, no, I think they were in the same spot, maybe lower at number 3. But yeah, this deck is probably like what you'd find in the basics of it. I think well, this one actually got to 3155 last season in a ranked with red that is currently live on the channel now. If you want to watch it, that's a shameless plug. But hey, we all gotta have one once in a while. But yeah, pretty much that's the greed deck as a whole. As I mentioned, the way you want to stop this deck is just straight aggression, and of course trying to pick off their more useful buildings. I mean, once you really do pick off those buildings, they're gonna have a hard time because they're going to work off the single draw, and that's pretty much how they end up defeating themselves. Just you cut off their resources, and they're sort of just like, what do I do? So with that being said, I'm not going to cover too much into this greed deck, of course, because we've already done so, and just jump right into the deck that's currently occupying the #1 slot. And currently occupying the deck, or the #1 spot on this season of Meta Monthly, is of course Red Yellow. Now Red Yellow of course comes in a variety of different deck types. We've got your just general good stuff. You got Undead like you see here. You've got Last Will, and I think one else. Oh, Knights. That's what I'm forgetting. Knight. You can see Knights in there as well. But overall, this has been probably the most popular faction or combination of factions, I should say, pretty much for one reason, and that's the Warlock access to direct damage. Cards like Dragon's Fire, Defective Flame Cannon, Blue Firebolt, Flamestorm, all the good stuff that might be needed every once in a while to clear off a building or take down a pesky unit is found solely within the Warlock faction. But I mean, there are alternatives to this. Obviously, pirate debuffs and druid companions are probably the first two things that come to mind to sort of substitute for warlock damage. But nothing kind of beats that just direct damage. I play a spell, I get rid of it, I move on, and it's kind of the reason why it's a very popular deck. Um, the last two decks that I mentioned, of course, Traps and Greed, do rely on building centerpieces. So with this deck, you could pretty much zap those away and keep on going and forcing your opponent to take pretty much a new strategy, a new route, change up their gameplay a lot. Whereas you don't have to change anything. You've just simply done what your deck needed to do. Um, I will say that this deck isn't totally unbeatable, however. Um, Usually, depending on I don't want to leave it up to draws, but I would say a lot of it based on personal experience. And that's not to hate on people who don't win with these with these colors. Excuse me. Whew. Um, it's just usually when you have unexperienced players with deck types jumping on the meta bandwagon, that's what you're going to see. Them making rash and impulsive plays, which you can capitalize on with the deck that you know and you've been playing for a while. So it's really just a matter of outskilling the opponent in that regard. Um, Although, like I said, it's not totally unbeatable. Sometimes draws and plays by you certainly impact the game. So again, not totally unbeatable, but I would say it's pretty rough to see this deck pretty much pop up maybe once every 3 or 4 games. Um, and yeah, it's repetitive, but I mean at least it's not completely broken. I mean maybe some people might argue that they don't like the colors and that it is broken, but for me it's not a totally broken deck. And obviously, like I mentioned previously, with new cards we could always see an update that changes the landscape of cards and castles dramatically. But until then, we kind of just have to wait and see. Oh yeah, and Unholy Altar's in here too. But I think people have heard enough about Unholy Altar, so I'm just gonna leave it there. Just gonna leave it right there. But yeah, that's pretty much all of the decks for this season of Meta Monthly, and not much else to say. Now, I know this has been a very short edition of Meta Monthly. Um, I mean, it's probably not going to be as long as some of the other ones or really as detailed. But the truth be told, nothing's really changed dramatically. And normally, when things don't change this dramatically, I tend not to do a meta monthly for that season. Because I feel like if it's the same thing, then why make a whole other video re-explaining it or repeating, the same points when you could easily just go and watch that one to essentially just bring you up to speed on what currently is happening. But there were some sort of shifts in strength there. Of course, we saw traps go down, and we saw Warlock Crusader retake the throne as the #1 meta deck of the season. But yeah, I mean there's really not much else to say about that. Hopefully, with the coming months, maybe not next month, or well, I think either next month or the following month after that, we should see a meta shakeup. Obviously, with new cards coming in very very soon, guaranteed to be by the end of summer. I mean, not at the end of summer, but somewhere between now and the end of summer, we are getting, of course, new cards. So that could, of course, have the chance of shaking the landscape of CNC dramatically. But yeah, that's really much all from me for now. If you guys enjoyed this video, please be sure to give it a like, share with your friends, and comment down below your thoughts on the meta decks for May and June of 2018. And if you are, while you're down there, if you haven't done so already, that's what I was trying to say, make sure to hit that subscribe button and show your support to the channel. Help us grow all by clicking that subscribe button at no additional cost to you. With that being said, guys, that's all from me for now. So until next time, stay gaming.